Sig and Holosun both just released upgrades to their line of budget red dots, this being the Romeo5 Gen 2 and the Holosun ARO. Both of these are designed to replace their existing budget dot offerings, but are these changes enough to convince you to buy? Do these stand alone as great red dots? And do they compare to each other? These are two different brands and a little bit of style of red dot. And so the question comes down to which one is a better choice for your budget red dot. Sig and Holosun before these two changes both had excellent baselines for budget red dots, this being the Romeo5 Gen 1 and the 403/503 line from Holosun. These as red dots were simple, they were budget, and they accomplished what they set out to do well. And as we've discussed in other videos, the Romeo5 Gen 2 and the ARO are great adjustments to this line. While the features they add aren't insanely different than their older offerings, they are great upgrades, and it's nice to see. But how do they stack up to each other? Two budget red dot offerings from two different companies. On the surface, there are some similarities we should discuss first. Obviously, they're both circular style red dots. The buttons for them both are in a very similar position and function the same way. The turrets for them are almost the exact same and in very similar positions, but as we start to look more into the fine differences between these red dots, we really start to see those details change. First, with the way the housing is designed, the battery tray and caps on these two are definitely different. The Romeo5 features a battery cap. This is a side cap that can be unscrewed and holds a battery underneath, whereas the ARO features a battery tray, whereas the battery is stored horizontally below the optic itself. These two are very different styles, but objectively, the Sig version of the battery cap is easier to use since it can be removed with ordinary tools like a flathead, a quarter, or a shell casing, whereas the ARO requires a special tool bit in order to take out that battery tray. Both of these red dots use a T2 mounting style system, meaning you'll be able to use these red dots with aftermarket mounts designed for the T2, which is a welcome feature. However, there is a height difference between the two. Because the ARO stores its battery below the red dot itself, it does increase the height of this red dot slightly, meaning if you are intending to use this in line with the flip magnifier, there will be a slight height difference. This is hard to notice in purpose though, because the Romeo5 Gen 2 and the ARO both come with different mount heights, so they don't even line up out of the box. The Romeo5 comes with a 1.4, which is an absolute co-witness mount, and a low mount, whereas the ARO comes with a 1.63, which is a lower 1/3 mount and a low mount. So both of these out of the box will be able to mount to a lower height pretty comparably, but the ARO does sit taller and come with a taller mount than the Romeo5. In general, this comes down to preference. Some people like having a higher dot mount. Some people like getting closer to the board. That depends on where you like your red dot to sit. And even if you don't like the way it comes out of the box, you can get aftermarket mounts for both of these because they use a T2 style, which if you do want an aftermarket mount, you can pick it up at defensedistributors.com. The Romeo5 features a traditional Torx screw, so you can just screw that down into place, but you're not able to remove it by hand. You will need a tool, whereas the ARO features a hex style screw, which you can use a wrench to tighten that down far more than you can by your hands, but it is also able to be taken off by hand because of its design. Now, I'm not a particularly huge fan of QDs or thumb screws on optics themselves. Magnifiers is another matter, and accessories, but this is something to consider if you are a fan of one versus the other. The Romeo5 weighs 5.5 ounces and the ARO weighs 3.38 ounces. Now, this is getting into a larger difference in weight. The Romeo5 definitely weighs more than the ARO, but it's not by a huge amount. The Romeo5 is spec'd out to weigh 5.5 ounces, and the ARO is spec'd out to weigh 3.38 ounces, but in person, it's really not that big of a difference. I wouldn't consider this when choosing one over the other. The weight isn't really enough to notice. Now, battery. These two feature the exact same type of battery, but the listed battery hours on them are different. The Romeo5 features a battery life of 40,000 hours on a specific setting that they've listed in their manual, whereas the ARO features 50,000 hours in a comparable setting. So the ARO will last slightly longer, but when you're getting into these crazy high numbers of hours, that shouldn't also be a consideration between the two. Both of these feature shake-awake settings and a 2 MOA dot, but the actual settings you can get each in are different. The Romeo5 in this specific consideration only comes with a 2 MOA dot, whereas the ARO can be had in this consideration in a MRS system, which is multi-reticle, so I can switch between a dot if I want a circle dot or a dot with a circle. Now, there is a difference in price in those settings, so for the sake of this comparison, we are using the base models because they are of a similar price, but it should be noted that you can get the same format in different reticle settings, whereas you cannot get the Romeo5 in the same format. The settings on these are the exact same. There are 12 settings, 10 daylight and 2 night vision, but the way you activate them is different. Yes, they both feature button styles on the top that are very, very similar. However, the way they fundamentally function is different. The Romeo5 features a hold-on function, meaning in order to turn on this red dot, I will have to hold that button for 1 or 2 seconds for it to turn on. And to turn it off, I will have to do the same thing. Now, adjusting between modes is still a tap system. However, the Holosun ARO is a single tap button system. I only have to tap this button once to turn it on. This will allow for you to more speedily turn on the ARO, but it will be a little bit harder to accidentally turn on the Romeo 5. The Romeo 5 does not have a ton of parallax, but it does have some parallax, and that will be noticeable more at distance, whereas the ARO has pretty incredible parallax for a dot of this size. If you're choosing between them on glass clarity or parallax, the ARO does win in that category. So which one of these budget dots should you buy, the Romeo 5 Gen 2 or the Holosun ARO? There were some key differences we discussed in this video, but I don't think that any of them specifically are enough to really push you over the edge on one versus the other. In all honesty, I think what this really comes down to, and what it's going to come down to for most buyers, is the look of these two red dots, maybe the height, but more so than that, the brand between these two. Are you a Sig fan or are you a Holosun fan? I think that's what it's going to come down to. But know this, whichever one of these red dots you do decide on getting, both of them are great budget standard options from each brand, and so you really can't go wrong with either of them. And you can't go wrong with them, especially for the price. These two are very, very inexpensive for the features they bring. I'm not going to state the prices specifically in this video because they do change, but if you want the pricing on them, you can go to the link in the description, defensedistributors.com. And if you want any additional accessories for them, the red dots themselves, the magnifiers, you can also go to the link in the description.